And hello, everyone, and welcome to today's ACLU Leadership Forum. For those of you who haven't joined us before, my name is Deborah Archer. I use she, her pronouns, and I am president of the ACLU. And I'm so grateful to see the record number of RSVPs for this event series we hold for our major donors, especially coming off of a historic and really inspiring day at the Supreme Court yesterday. We're going to dive into Barbara v. Trump, of course, our landmark birthright citizenship case, and answer as many of your pre-submitted questions as possible. But let me first remind everyone that this is an off-the-record conversation. So if you're a journalist among us, we're really happy that you're here. But please note that nothing said here is for attribution or citation, because it's very important for us, for everyone to feel like this is a safe space to raise their questions and for you to raise your questions. If you have any questions during the program, you can use the Q&A button that's at the bottom of your screen. And we've also reserved some time at the end for Q&A, and we'll get to as many as we can before the time is up. So let's now turn to the Birthright Citizenship case, which is the latest addition to the ACLU's Joan and Irwin Jacobs Supreme Court docket. Since our founding in 1920, the ACLU has been involved in roughly 80% of all civil liberties cases heard before the court. And that includes Brown versus Board of Education. It includes Loving versus Virginia. And the ACLU has appeared before the court more than any other private organization. And we've participated in more cases than any entity except the federal government. So we are no stranger to Supreme Court, and our teams know what it takes to boldly defend our rights before that court. And I'm thrilled to welcome an all-star panel of that team to join us today. And first was the star of the arguments yesterday, Cecillia Wang, the ACLU National Legal Director, who delivered masterful arguments yesterday. Welcome. Next, we have Cody Wofsy. And Cody is Deputy Director of the ACLU's Immigrants' Rights Project, who was also the chief architect of this case that we're going to talk about today. And then we have Anu Joshi, the ACLU's National Campaign Director for Immigration, who helped organize the ACLU's complementary advocacy and public mobilization work. And I want to congratulate you all for what was really Herculean work. You and the many staffers and coalition partners and all the supporters who turned out yesterday and before yesterday and worked alongside you and made all of this possible. So for the first half of this briefing, I'm going to chat with our litigators. So Anu, I'm sorry, please sit tight, and we'll be sure to pull you in to give voice to the key role that public protest and accountability has played. So we'll see you soon. And we're going to start with you, Cecillia. I was absolutely honored to be in the courtroom yesterday to cheer you on. And I could not have been prouder of you and the entire ACLU team. It was a master class in advocacy, both in the skill of advocacy and in the substance that you delivered. It really was incredible. You stood before the highest court in the land and argued with such passion and knowledge and conviction for the soul of the 14th Amendment. And you brought months of preparation and brilliance and moral clarity into that chamber. And we were all grateful. And as I said that to you yesterday after the argument, we were grateful, we were inspired, and we were proud. We've been calling this case a bellwether case, and we received some pre-submitted questions on this front about how the stakes go far beyond immigration. They go beyond birthright citizenship, really. So, for example, Richard R. asked how the case may shed light on the Trump administration's attempted overreach in other areas. So I'm hoping that you can address all of those things, the stakes in the case for immigration, beyond immigration, and what this kind of tells us about other attempts of overreach by the Trump administration.
Sure. Thank you so much, Deborah, for those generous reflections. It really was an honor to stand up there. Only one person gets to stand at the lectern when the case gets to the Supreme Court, but it was a huge team led by Cody that I was basically giving voice to, and of course for our clients too. So to get the question, I think the birthright citizenship case is like so many of the cases that we've had to bring since January of 2025, in that the president's trying to make this an issue about a marginalized community that he thinks is unpopular. And so he's tried to cast the issue of 14th Amendment citizenship as an issue about undocumented immigrants, or about birth tourism, to use his derogatory phrase, when in fact, this is about a central piece of the Reconstruction Constitution, as you said, Deborah, our 14th Amendment. And most people, when you say the 14th Amendment, they think about the Equal Protection Clause. But the Citizenship Clause is the first sentence in the 14th Amendment, and it came out of the advocacy of free Black Americans who fought not only for their own citizenship or the citizenship of Black Americans, but for universal birthright citizenship for everyone. And so this is a case, I think, where, Trump is trying to go after immigrants and their US born children who've always been US citizens from birth as a way to advance his policy preferences, in order to be a hard right extremist on immigration, when in fact the case is about who we are as a nation. And I think it's a case where he has overreached, he's overstepped himself. And I think he'll find, and we see in the papers, that the majority of Americans don't like what he's doing, and don't like the position he's taken on birthright citizenship. So I think it's a bellwether case in that, knock wood, if we do prevail, as many observers are commenting that people are confident we're going to win this case, I think we're going to see an opportunity where people will start to see through the rhetoric, and understand that what the president is espousing with this executive order is contrary to who we want to be as a country.
Yeah, thank you for that. I appreciate your reflections. I especially like the way that you have connected this to some of the trends that we are seeing across this administration, that they will target unpopular people or communities and in the process do damage, real damage to other people as well, but also to the kind of fundamental structure and foundation of our democracy. People like to see things in silos and don't often see the connections and the patterns. And so I appreciate very much you highlighting that as well. And for Cody, as Cecillia said, that you were the architect, you were lead on this case, and so really happy that you were here with us. I want to ask you to, before you talk about what happened yesterday, to take us back a little bit further and to speak to the preparation for this case and building this case, which
Yeah,
began well before the executive order. How were you able to anticipate that this would be one of the first things that he did out the gate?
absolutely. And thanks so much. I'm really happy to be here with everyone on the call, and thanks so much for your support. Um, so for us, actually, in the Immigrants' Rights Project, this story starts way before the executive order. For me, it really starts in the first Trump administration. We fought on so many different fronts during that time period. They learned a lot of lessons and came in ready to go this time. But we also learned a lot of lessons. And one of the lessons that we learned was the importance of preparation and advanced thinking whenever possible. And so, early in 2024, almost a year before the executive order was signed, we sat down and engaged in a very robust planning process across the entire issue area. And we mapped out every single threat we could identify, from Project 2025, from public statements, campaign, issues, etc. And we ran through them, we prioritized them in terms of how much is this really striking at the heart of our constitutional system, how much of an impact is this going to have on immigrant communities and mixed status families? And then we also looked at, is this something we've litigated before and therefore have a good understanding of already, or is this something that's really pretty new to us and it's going to require quite a lot of work? And that's what we focused on, is that last category. So an example of that beyond this is the Alien Enemies Act litigation that we've been leading across the country. We had an entire working group during 2024 analyzing that, doing the historical research, and we did likewise for birthright citizenship. Obviously, in this case, there's a Supreme Court precedent on point, but still, we knew we were going to be in for a fight, and we did all the legal research, the historical research, the strategizing, connecting with potential clients, connecting with partner organizations across the entire space to make sure that we were going to be ready to go on day one. And indeed, that's exactly when the Trump administration, when Trump signed this executive order, and we were ready with our partners. We have an incredible co-counsel team and organizational plaintiffs in our first case. We were able to sue just 2 hours after the executive order was signed. There's been a lot of water under the bridge in the litigation since then, and among other things, the birthright citizenship issue went up to the Supreme Court already once on a procedural question in the Trump versus Casa case. And as folks know, I think that that decision put some limits on the ability of courts to issue what's called universal injunctions. Without getting into too many of the technicalities, the upshot of that decision was that if we did nothing, there was a very real chance that some babies targeted by this executive order were going to be stripped of their citizenship while the litigation proceeded. And we knew that that was a very real possibility in that case, and we knew that that was not an acceptable outcome. And so once again, we were ready to go with our second case, which is a class action, a different procedural vehicle, and again, filed within a couple of hours of the CASA decision. And that, of course, is the Barber case, which was argued just yesterday. Just one more quick note on this. I know some folks have wondered, why did the Supreme Court even take up this issue, given kind of how clear cut the questions are? And part of the answer actually is that procedural history. Because the case had already gone up to the Supreme Court, there had been a lot of discussion in the CASA case, both at argument and in the opinion, about justices basically saying, when are we going to take a look at the merits of this? We need to get to it. And so it would have been, I think, a little odd for them to then decline to do so. But I think probably the bigger point is that the Trump administration explicitly said this is one of our top priorities. And in general, that's going to be enough for the Supreme Court to take up any case when a top priority of the executive has been struck down.
Yeah, thank you for that. You were mentioning the array of people that were part of this team and this coalition. And it's clear that a coalition of that size with the kind of varied expertise that you had on it was necessary to meet the moment, because this is a constitutional law case, it's an immigration case, but it's also a racial justice case, a statutory interpretation case, a separation of powers case. It really could just fill an entire law school curriculum with this case alone. Can you outline kind of all the specific pieces that were at play? Can you break that down a little bit for us? Maybe we'll stay with Cody.
Yeah, absolutely. It is an incredibly complicated case. I mean, if you look at the Supreme Court's docket, which you can go to the website and see, you'll see that there are, I think, something like 45 amicus briefs in this case, which is, 8 times more than any case I've ever worked on before. It's really extraordinary. Part of that, of course, is how important the issue is, but part of it is also that there are so many different questions that come into play. Whether, you heard questions yesterday about Native American law, about statutory interpretation, about the history of the Know Nothing Party, about the history of the debates in 1866, or what was happening in Congress in 1940, Constitution, statute, the list goes on and on. Ultimately, though, in our view, the case is actually pretty simple. And as Cecilia sort of referred to, history is the touchstone here. You start at the beginning of the country's history, and the rule was very clear. It was a rule that we inherited from England, along with a lot of legal rules. And it was, if a child was born here of immigrant parents, that person was a U.S. citizen. It was largely unquestioned during, the first century of the American Republic. And that was the rule that was part of the backdrop when Dred Scott was decided. That rule was a recognition of citizenship for white immigrants, but the you know, for Black Americans, whether enslaved or free, it was much more complicated and contested, and in many cases, deeply tied up with the sin of slavery. And so what Dred Scott said, among other things, was that Black Americans could never be citizens, whether they were enslaved or born free. That was a big part of what led to the Civil War. And it was, the purpose of the 14th Amendment was to reject that, but not to reject that in a way that would only, be specifically helpful for Black people or some specific contingent. Instead, as Cecilia said, the understanding from free Black activists, from Republicans in Congress, was that birthright citizenship is a universal principle. Everyone who's born here, with only these rare exceptions, uh, were citizens of the United States. That's what you see reflected in the language and so forth. It was a rejection of an idea of citizenship that would be based on exclusion and division and a caste that would be lesser than the rest of the American citizenry. Fast forward to 30 years to Wong Kim Ark, and essentially what you see is the United States government trying to undo that language, trying to say, well, what if we carve out a different category of folks for exclusion from citizenship? In that case, it was the children of Chinese immigrants. And the court rejected that. I think very notably rejected it at a moment of incredibly vehement anti-Chinese racist politics. It was bipartisan. There were statutes being passed in Congress all the time that were singling out Chinese immigrants for, really exceptional burdens and exclusions. And this same Supreme Court was upholding those laws. And yet, because the history was so clear, because the Constitution was so clear, the court said, no, this is a universal rule. This is what Congress is trying to do. This is what the Constitution means. I think that one of the most remarkable things about this entire litigation and executive order is just how much the Trump administration has been recycling the same ideas, the same arguments, the same sources from the government's arguments and positions in Wong Kim Ark that were rejected, and even going all the way back to Dred Scott. It is a through line all the way through of trying to define citizenship in terms of exclusion and division. And that is just not what America's about, and it's not what our Constitution says.
Thank you for that. The case is so fundamentally important. As you hinted to, the president has said that birthright citizenship is how we made the children of slaves citizens. And yes, birthright citizenship is how the United States made citizens of formerly enslaved people and the children of formerly enslaved people. And yes, it's how we began to atone for our original sin of chattel slavery. But it's also how a whole nation of immigrants became one nation out of many. Birthright citizenship is really a foundational pillar in our grand experiment of U.S. democracy. And it is hallowed ground for everyone in the civil rights community. So I hope that people understand just how fundamentally important it is. And I appreciate you helping us understand how it extends far beyond just a question around immigration. Thank you for that. Cecillia, we got a lot of questions about the actual experience of arguing before the Supreme Court. Very few lawyers actually get to stand where you stood yesterday. So can you talk about your preparation for the arguments and then the actual arguments, like what it was, what it felt like to be in that space? And then to add on to that, you were thrown a wide range of questions. What did you take from the questions that you received? What did you take from the questions the government received? And what did you take from the government's arguments?
So the preparation felt very compressed. I had to I mean that phrase drinking from a fire hose has never felt more apt. And without Cody and a few of our colleagues in the ACLU Immigrants' Rights Project and colleagues at our co-counsel organizations, I could not have done it. You know, like you said, there's a specialized Supreme Court bar that argues, the majority of cases in the Supreme Court. And as the national legal director of the ACLU, I think I'm, an ex officio member of that Supreme Court bar. But it's a relatively new experience for me to jump into a case in the last 15 minutes of the fourth quarter and have to, channel this enormous amount of work that this team did. I was joking when we had lunch after the argument yesterday. I never thought I'd be up at the Supreme Court as a champion of the English common law. It was, I
And
know
as an expert about the Know Nothing Party.
exactly. And that's where the amicus briefs Cody raised came in. I didn't read all the 45 amicus briefs that were filed in the case, but I read a good number of them. And of course, was very familiar with our brief that we'd worked on as a team. And so there was a lot of, cramming, basically. Anyone who's taken an exam knows what I did. But one thing that's unique maybe for practicing, for preparing for a legal argument is we do moot courts, which is basically a practice run. We do this for every, at the ACLU, anyone who's doing an appellate argument will do a practice run. And for Supreme Court arguments, we do a large number of moot courts where we invite Supreme Court practitioners and subject matter experts, usually trying to reflect the ideological spectrum on the court. And we did, I think, 7 of those formal practice runs, moot courts, with a range of right to left lawyers. And they were extraordinarily helpful. There is no, I mean, I can say without any doubt that I could not have done that argument without the input of some very conservative lawyers who were generously gave us their time and their insights on how to argue the case. And that's on top of, all the core work that the team did. And that goes right up to the last minute. A lot of people ask me, were you nervous? It was very cute. Yesterday, after last night, a bunch of us on the team who were staying at the hotel in DC were just hanging out in the bar and having some dinner. And there was a moot court competition. A bunch of law students were staying in the hotel, and a bunch of them came up to me and said, "Hey, are you the person who just argued this case in the Supreme Court?" I said, "Yes." And they said, "Wow, were you nervous?" And I said, "Of course I was nervous. I thought I was going to vomit." So many times in the last few days, Cody knows. But somehow, part of the preparation too is to remember why we're there.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, part of the reason I'm there is because I'm a 14th Amendment citizen. My parents were immigrants. They had not yet naturalized when I was born, and they're both gone now, but they're very much with me. And the ancestors and living parents of many of our team members were with me. That was definitely part of the preparation to reflect and meditate on what we're standing up for. And that's the Central American dream that you come here and you're part of it. We all belong here.
That's right. It's something that a few of us share, as I too am a citizen because of the 14th Amendment. And I just wanted to add, I shared this with you. You were not the only one nervous. I mentioned to Cecillia that I was sitting next to one of her best friends. And when Cecillia finally walked into the courtroom with this enormous smile on her face, her friend breathed the biggest sigh of relief that I have ever heard in my life because she was holding that tension for you. We were all holding that tension for you, but appreciate you sharing the preparation because yesterday you made it look easy. But we know that that took months of preparation and you were drinking from a hot fire hose and so much more. But you were just spectacular and made it look quite simple and appreciate you sharing that. Cody, you were also a key part of the preparations. And of course, you were also in the courtroom yesterday. And I don't know if there's anything else that you'd like to add about the experience leading up to yesterday and in the courtroom yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, on nervousness, a lot of people were nervous. I can share. I fielded a lot of panicked phone calls from various members of the legal community and others. I wasn't. First of all, I knew Cecilia was going to be amazing, and she was. We all heard it. So I had complete faith. Cecilia was my first boss when I started at the ACLU 10 years ago. And I just feel incredibly privileged to have gotten to go through this process with her. Also, we're right on everything, and their arguments are largely held together with, toothpicks and scotch tape. Um, in terms of the preparation, it was very intensive. And, a big part of what you're doing anytime you're preparing for oral argument is trying to envision what questions you're going to get and what are the going to be the hardest questions. And that's a sort of exercise in imagination. It's an exercise in trying to put yourself in the position of people who might have a fundamentally different worldview from you, who might have different experiences, who might be thinking about different things. Some questions may be hostile, some questions may be friendly, some questions may be confused. Um, and, part of what we're doing is trying to come up with every possible question we can think of so that we know how to answer those questions. And I will say people ask, sort of what were you surprised by? The truth is that the argument went largely how I had hoped and envisioned it would go. The questions that were asked were each of them things that we had discussed ad nauseum, had thought through, had practiced. And, I think that that just goes to show, number one, what an incredible team we have, both, you know, ourselves, our co-counsel, our affiliates on this case who have been an absolute central part of the process from the very beginning, and all of the many experts and scholars and lawyers who have contributed to our thinking and preparation in so many different ways, amicus briefs, moots, just long phone calls about this or that wrinkle in the case. Um, and I think that, that's our hope is that when Cecilia stands up there, it looks easy from the outside. I can assure you it is not. And, she just did a masterful, masterful job up at the podium.
Yeah.
There was one question in particular that we got that Cody predicted virtually word for word. And it was a very specific hypothetical.
And you're not going to share which one that was?
Now, I think I'll keep that
All right.
within the team. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you both. I was fully confident in our position and the strength of our case before yesterday, and it was only strengthened by the oral argument. So I appreciate you all sharing all those details. Anu, you have been so incredibly patient with us, and I'd love to bring you into the conversation and talk about the incredible work that your team has been leading. Outside of the court, public outcry and really public action has bolstered the fight against this administration and its horrific immigration practices in particular. Last weekend, the ACLU and coalition partners organized more than 3,300 No Kings rallies. And we gathered at least 8 million people across the country. And then yesterday, our team was outside the court rallying public support for birthright citizenship. And I'm hoping, Anu, that you can share more about your role in this fight, what you've been seeing on the front lines and the work to pull people into this fight with us.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. And so incredible to hear about what happened yesterday. So, as you mentioned, I'm the National Campaigns Director for Immigration here at the National ACLU, working in our political advocacy department. So, I'm leading the campaigns that are happening outside of the courtroom, whether that's targeting Congress, the state legislatures, in partnership, deep partnership with our affiliates in the streets, like at No Kings. And as you have laid out already, as folks have heard, the stakes in this case obviously could not be higher. And as you just mentioned, Deborah, I think it's really important to put this case, though, in the broader context of the attacks that have been happening on immigrant communities that have really intensified over the last 15 months. This did not happen in a vacuum. And we know that the president didn't hide what his goals were when he was on the campaign trail. He said that his goal was to deport 1 million people a year. His goal was to fundamentally remake this country in his own vision. And birthright citizenship and the attack on birthright citizenship is like one prong of that effort to redefine who belongs in America based off his beliefs. And so I think about that goal that he laid out in kind of three main prongs. And birthright citizenship fits so squarely in his attacks on it within those three prongs. So, the first, and what we've seen happen over the last 15 months, is that this administration has aggressively targeted all undocumented people, whether they arrived last year or whether they have been in this country for decades, whether they have families, whether they are workers. This is what we're seeing when we're seeing, masked agents targeting people at Home Depot or going door to door or even arresting people, ripping families apart when they're showing up for their court cases, when they're doing what they're supposed to do, what the government asked them to do. We're seeing it in legalized racial profiling, right? So this is kind of the first prong is making everyone vulnerable and making everyone afraid of what could happen and that they could be next. I think the second prong that's really important is that this administration is doing everything they can to limit who can come into the country. So they're doing everything they can to slow down processing, making it harder for people to become citizens. Right now, the backlog for naturalization ceremonies is horrendous. For people who are trying to reunite with their family members who are abroad, if your spouse is overseas, it's taking so much longer than it ever has. And we can't forget that they have instituted the same type of racist Muslim ban that we saw from Trump 1.0, but now they've expanded it to 93 countries. So if you are from one of those countries and you're trying to bring your loved ones over, your parents, your spouse, your children, you're kind of out of luck. And the government is telling you that you don't deserve to be with your family. And then the last is, what's most important in this case, most relevant, is stripping people of their status who are already here, like babies born in the United States, right? So that includes, though, like targets on people who have deferred action for childhood arrivals or DACA or temporary protected status, TPS. Already in the past 15 months, the administration has stripped over 1 million people of their status, of work permits, of protection from deportation. And if this attack on birthright citizenship were to go forward, if it was allowed to go into effect, I mean, we would just see that number balloon, right? And so it's just, I think, really important that, this administration, all of these things, of course, are designed to inflict harm. They're tearing families apart. They're striking fear in the hearts of immigrant communities and mixed status families and US citizens who love people who are undocumented. We're watching as immigrant families are terrified to leave their homes, go to work, go to school, go to doctor's appointments. And so that this attack on birthright citizenship is all part of that. And I think at its core, it's to make people feel like this is not their country, that they don't belong here. And I think in President Trump's ideal scenario, it's that people, decide to leave their homes and to self-deport, right? Like that's what we've heard him talk about. And so, I think that is it, that is what is at stake in this case.
I hope that Cecilia and Cody felt the same way, but it was a tremendous feeling to walk out of the courthouse yesterday and then to see this beautiful rally, this collection of people holding signs and chanting and singing and doing all these wonderful things in support of this work. Can you just talk very quickly about the Birthright rally itself and the turnout?
Yeah, it was really incredible. And Cecilia, I hope you heard us chanting your name as you were walking out. It was very loud, but we were. Everyone was very excited. We had literally hundreds and hundreds of people outside the courthouse on the steps. We were lucky enough to have Bishop Barber from the Repairers of the Breach open up the event and talk about the legacy of the 14th Amendment. And
Anu, can I just say I'm shocked that you had him open up because who wants to follow Reverend
I
Barber, right?
know,
Like
I know. He
that was
was
a tough
so
one.
good. And I mean, he talked about, right, like this direct connection between the struggle for Black civil rights and immigrant rights, and like could do it with such moral clarity. I mean, it was really incredible. And I think more than that, like the breadth of organizations that were involved in planning and showing up. I mean, legacy civil rights organizations, immigrant rights groups, the ACLU, obviously. So, I think it was incredible. The ACLU had a petition where asking people to sign their name in support of birthright citizenship. We had over 250,000 people sign that petition. So, I think it just expresses the breadth of the support here.
But then we also used those names as a sort of public amicus brief, and we did a light display of the names on a nearby church. It was really beautiful and spectacular. So just want to thank you for all the effort that you have done. Again, Cecilia said one person gets to stand at that podium, but all of the people involved in supporting this work and in spreading the word, not just at the ACLU, but what the public at large, and you were instrumental in beautifully bringing people into this moment as well, and deeply appreciate that work. Anu was talking about the broader goal of some of the immigration efforts of this administration. So, Cody, I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about our broader immigration rights litigation docket in response to all of the horrible things that Anu says this administration is trying to do.
Absolutely. And, this case has been kind of a full-time job for a couple of my colleagues for months now, and, a big part of my um, day for quite a while. But we are doing so much more, and my colleagues are running all over the country, litigating on every single front of this battle. So as Anu said, this is the most anti-immigrant administration in at least 100 years, maybe ever. And they came in with a plan. We're going to absolutely blanket the field with attempts to, reshape the demographics of the country, to slash immigration, to, attack immigrant communities and mixed status families, to make people afraid, to make people, as Anu said, feel the need to self-deport. And that's been, hundreds and hundreds of different initiatives that they've undertaken. And the hope was that they would be able to sort of overwhelm us and our partner organizations and immigrant communities, and everyone would just give up. What we've actually seen is the opposite. In particular, the ACLU and its affiliates have stepped up in an enormous way to take on the Trump administration's attacks on immigrant communities. I'll give you some numbers. Since January of 2025, we've filed 112 separate lawsuits. That's us and our affiliates, 136 legal actions total. And, these are some of the most important issues facing the country today. I'll highlight a couple that have been particularly important at the moment. So I mentioned the Alien Enemies Act earlier, and, that is a fundamental attack on the right to due process. It was an effort to just shuffle people out of the country in the middle of the night without even a basic hearing. And my colleagues working primarily on that case were working around the clock. they ended up needing to file after the first Supreme Court decision cases all around the country. We saw our affiliates step up and file cases in court after court after court, meeting the Department of Justice, going toe to toe with them. And the fight's continuing, but we took it all the way to the Supreme Court and we won a vital victory in the AARP decision, which meant, the Supreme Court went out of its way in the middle of the night to tell the Trump administration, no, due process matters. You have to give people hearings. And the administration backed down. There has not been one single Alien Enemies Act removal since that very first day when the planes were stopped. And
Yeah.
that's one example of the ways in which we're fighting on a whole range of different issues, and doing it in all the courts all around the country with our affiliates. 60% of our cases that have been filed have defeated, diluted, or delayed the Trump agenda in some way. I could not be more proud of the work that our team is doing, and it is only possible because we have supporters and members who are able to, provide the resources both for us to do our jobs and for the affiliates to critically grow their staff, including their specifically immigrants' rights staff, which we've seen just massively increase since the first Trump administration.
I appreciate that you highlighting that this is not just a fight in the federal system, right? Everything doesn't make it to the Supreme Court, and everything isn't out about our federal courts. Anu, can you join in with what Cody was talking about and highlight some of the ACLU state level wins with our affiliates? And then can you talk a little bit about how folks on this call can keep up momentum in our own communities?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, similar to what Cody was saying, we're seeing some incredible work at the state legislative level by our affiliates, like taking advantage of this huge momentum and really the changing attitudes of the public and kind of the disgust with the overreach and violence that ICE and Border Patrol have been inflicting on communities. So, just as one example, in the first 3 months of 2026, we saw historic legislation, honestly, that they had been fighting for years, passed by our ACLU affiliate in New Mexico, signed into law and this bill prohibits state and local governments from entering into agreements to put individuals into detention and stops the use of public land for immigration detention. And then it also bans any local law enforcement from entering into agreements with ICE or Border Patrol. So this is something that they've been working on for years. And in the course of 3 months, we're finally able to make it a reality and ensure that New Mexico could, deliver on its commitment to stand with immigrant families. And we saw very similarly in Maryland, a broad coalition of groups, including our Maryland ACLU affiliate, have been fighting for over a decade for a ban on local law enforcement partnerships with ICE, something called 287G. And actually, just a few weeks ago, we watched as Governor Wes Moore signed that 287G ban into law. And there are 9 counties that were currently participating in these 287G agreements, and that will have an immediate impact on immigrant families in Maryland. So I just like 2 huge wins that are symbolic of what's happening across the country. And I would not be a good campaigner, Deborah, if I didn't take you up on your offer. Want to make sure that everyone knows you can sign up for our national organizing network through People Power, which is our platform for grassroots actions where anyone can work with us, be a volunteer, mobilize communities across the country to defend and advance civil rights and civil liberties for all. Makiba just put the link in the chat, and so hope to see you on one of our next People Power action calls.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for all of that. I know that we are short on time, and I really want to get to the Q&A. We have lots of questions that have been submitted. We are going to have to stay tuned for the court's decision. It doesn't happen until sometime in June. And so maybe we'll come back to you with an update. But for now, we're going to turn it over to Makiba to take us to the Q&A.
Yes, happy to share. So for this first batch, we're starting off with a question from Holly. Can you clarify the various questions and answers regarding Native American citizenship and birth on tribal land? Then from Susan, can you clarify the challenge around the word quote unquote domiciled and the significance of Wang Kim Ark's parents being domiciled in the US? And then from Kay, do you believe the recent No Kings protests just the week before this hearing impacted the court in any noticeable way? If so, how?
So let's split up the first two questions.
Sounds good.
You want to pick first?
No, you go ahead.
Okay. I'll just take the first one then. So, for those of you who tuned in or have read the briefs in the case, you'll know that one of the arguments the government was making is based on a case that was decided by the Supreme Court before Wong Kim Ark called Elk versus Wilkins. So I'll have to take a little step back to explain what the government's argument is. The framers of the 14th Amendment excluded a very, very small number of people under these pre-existing historical exceptions to birthright citizenship that existed both in England under the rule that was brought over to our country and in the United States. And that one exception that was added to the English common law exceptions was an exception for members of Indian tribes. In short, the government was basically using language from this Elk versus Wilkins case, which explained the exclusion of Indian tribes from U.S. citizenship, in order to argue that, by analogy, the children of non-citizens in the United States are also excluded. It's a little bit complicated, so let me try to say one more sentence to explain it. The Indian tribes were excluded historically in the United States because at the time of the founding of our country, when the founders wrote the Constitution, it was ratified in 1789, Indian tribes were considered separate foreign nations that were fully encompassed, on U.S. territory, but that were really in a unique inter-sovereign relationship with the U.S. government. And so the framers wanted to keep that exception to U.S. citizenship when they made birthright citizenship otherwise universal. And the language the Supreme Court used to explain that exception in Elk versus Wilkins is that the United States does not exercise complete political jurisdiction over members of Indian tribes. And the government said that's true of foreign nationals too, because they also have their country of nationality exercising some jurisdiction over them when they're in the United States. That analogy actually falls apart completely because it's not the same relationship at all. And so that was one of the government's main arguments for why the children of non-citizens should be excluded. They were relying on an analogy to members of Indian tribes who were excluded under the original 14th Amendment citizenship clause. Hope that answers it. Didn't make it more confusing.
And I'll pick up on domicile, I'll be brief. Domicile is really the heart of the government's position in this case. Domicile is this legal concept in other areas of law, that was in use in the 19th century that just means residing somewhere with the intention to remain there indefinitely. Um, and, the government kind of offers a word salad of why it thinks domicile is required under the 14th Amendment, even though that is not what the 14th Amendment's words say. At the end of the day, I think basically their argument comes down to the fact that Wong Kim Ark's parents in this foundational decision, it was stipulated that they were domiciled in the United States, and the opinion says the word domiciled a number of times. You heard about this during the argument. The justices sort of puzzling over, why that particular choice to use that word in this particular sentence or that one might be. But as Cecillia explained, this sort of bottom line foundational problem with that argument is that it's not consistent with what Wong Kim Ark actually says. What it actually says is that we got our citizenship rule from English common law. And the government agrees with us that under English common law, this idea of domicile was irrelevant. And so that I think is helps to explain a little bit of why there was so much talk about it, why the government has chosen to kind of hitch its wagon to the idea of domicile, but also why at the end of the day that argument cannot succeed. Anu, do you want to talk about?
Yeah, I can try to answer this No Kings question, although I will not purport to know how the justices may or may not be influenced. But I'll just quickly say, we had 8 million people turn out last Saturday for No Kings, the largest single day protest in recent American history. I myself was in Seattle, which was beautiful. We had over 100,000 people in Seattle. And one of the things that I'll just raise that I thought was incredible was at the rally kind of event that happened at the end of the march. They actually had people break up by neighborhood so that folks could meet people in their neighborhood and figure out how to continue meeting, organizing, and taking action in their own communities. And so, yes, No Kings is a single day of protest, but I think the thing that is like so powerful about it is it's really about actually having a connection to your community and, leaning in to making the changes that you want to see protecting your neighbors.
Makiba, I think we can get to one more batch of questions.
Yeah, so I have just one more question for the group, and this comes from James C. He asked about what it will take to enforce a court order in our favor.
So I'll answer that, and Cody should jump in too. I'll answer that just by saying that I don't think that if we prevail in this case, I don't think this is something that the Trump administration is going to try to defy. This is going to be a clear order from the Supreme Court, if they rule in our favor, that says that his executive order is either unconstitutional or is contrary to a statute that Congress has enacted, or both. And we so far have not, we've seen Trump sort of, in other cases, not comply with court orders. But I don't think in this instance it's a situation where he's going to want to mess around. And so I think it'll simply be a matter of, the Supreme Court's decision going down as usual, back down to the lower courts for them to enter orders that comport with the Supreme Court. Cody, do you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, just a couple. I totally agree. I think in this case in particular, one of the things that's different about this than something like the Alien Enemies Act is that here the whole point of the order in the first place is to try and get the Supreme Court to say what he wants about the Constitution. So I don't think that, for example, they have some independent policy interest in denying passports to certain babies at the moment. This is about trying to get exactly the decision that the Solicitor General asked the court for yesterday. And, I have been saying from the day that that court reviews by the Supreme Court was granted that I am extremely confident that we are going to win this case. Nothing that happened yesterday dissuades me from that view at all. And so, assuming we win, if and when, that is the end of this effort. That will mean that the administration fundamentally has failed in this undertaking. But I want to take just a quick step back because I think, what's I think behind that question and what I hear from people a lot is, that things feel scary, that things feel uncertain, that the worry is that, what does it matter what courts and laws and everything else say if Trump is just going to do whatever he wants? Um, and, I share that worry. I think we all do. It is a scary moment in this country. But I think there also are important signs of hope. And again, I point you all to the Alien Enemies Act litigation. When you zoom back from that, it really was the most remarkable moment, I think, so far, in which the Trump administration tried to completely eliminate due process. The court initially said no. The administration said, basically, you're joking, right? Like, what if we put together a fake notice and fake hearing process? Nobody can actually get hearings, but you can wink and pretend, and we'll shuffle people out of the country without a hearing. And the court, again, in the middle of the night, ruled for us on an emergency application, which is a very uncommon occurrence, I can tell you, and said, no, we're serious. You have to give people hearings. And the Trump administration backed down, and the Trump administration has complied. And I think what that shows is the system, even though there's an enormous amount of human suffering happening, even though it's being tried in ways that it has never been tried before, that the system is holding. And those are the moments that give me hope that we will make it through this extremely frightening moment, and we will maintain our Constitution, we will maintain our democracy. And so I hope that the birthright citizenship win, assuming we get one, will be another moment that we can all share in and recognize that we are not lost. We have power, that we have legal tools. As Anu said, we have political tools. We have the power of people, and we can continue to fight back.
Thank you. Thank you, Anu, Cody, Cecillia. Thank you for joining us after what I know was an exhausting and exhilarating and long day yesterday. And thank you all so much for joining us today and sharing your questions. If we didn't get to your question, or you think about a question later that you didn't get to ask today, feel free to email us at leadershipforum@aclu.org. Thank you for your support. Your support, your engagement, your activism are all critical in this fight. So keep rising up, keep speaking out, keep saying loud. We are in this together because none of us can do this alone. So thank you so much for joining us. Bye-bye.